In 1764, tensions between the American colonies and the British overlords of those colonies are reaching a boiling point. Faced with rising debts from the French and Indian War, the British Empire sought to reduce their financial difficulties by levying taxes on their American citizens. Enter the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. These 5 acts were enacted by the British Parliament between 1764 and 1770 in an effort to assert its authority over the American colonies and generate revenue. The Sugar Act of 1764 was a statute enacted by the British government that placed taxes on imported goods to the American colonies, including foreign sugar, molasses, rum, and other goods. Additionally, the Act implemented more stringent anti-smuggling regulations and controlled the export of lumber and iron. The effect of the Sugar Act was a sugar crisis that caused economic hardship, depression, and resentment in the colonies, especially in New England and the Middle Colonies. The measure also questioned colonial autonomy and fostered mistrust of Parliament's activities.
This is the Sundeep Show.
The British Parliament, led by Prime Minister George Grenville, introduced the Sugar Act. George Grenville was an important member in King George III administration and served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1763 to 1765. After the French and Indian War, a number of laws and regulations were passed with the intention of boosting revenue and strengthening government authority over the American colonies. Among these was the Sugar Act. The British law, called the Currency Act of 1764, made the rules from the Currency Act of 1751 apply to all of their North American countries. Because there was a shortage of gold and silver, it made it illegal for the colonies to designate paper money as a legal tender for the payment of public and private debts. This led to terrible financial circumstances. The Act caused a great deal of economic pressure in the colonies by affecting trade and debt connections between the colonies and British merchants. Ben Franklin and other colonial representatives worked to have it overturned. The Act is seen as one of the elements that contributed to the rising tensions that led to the American Revolution. In 1765, the British government passed the Stamp Act, which levied a direct tax on the American colonies. It mandated the use of London Sow stamped paper for the production of newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. And now, the Townshend Acts were a series of laws passed by the British Parliament in 1767 that imposed taxes and regulations on the American colonies. They were called after the Chancellor of the Exchequer who recommended them, Charles Townshend. The Revenue Act of 1767 taxed goods coming from Britain that were made of glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The Customs Commissioners Act of 1767 established a body of officials responsible for enforcing trade regulations and levying duties. The Indemnity Act of 1767 reduced the tax on tea imported to Britain by the British East India Company, enabling the company to sell the commodity in America at a reduced price and thereby surpassing the smuggling syndicates. The New York Restraining Act of 1767 put a hold on the state legislature in the Empire State until it complied with the Quartering Act of 1765 and agreed to house and supply the British troops stationed there. Then we have the Tea Act of 1773 that lowered the tax on tea and gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea. Although the act was meant to keep the company out of bankruptcy, the American colonists felt that their rights had been violated The act led to the Boston Tea Party, a protest in which the colonists dumped tea into the harbor, and a major cause of the Revolutionary War. The Tea Act granted the East India Company the privilege of exporting tea directly to America from Britain duty-free, thereby reducing the price of their tea in comparison to the contraband Dutch tea that was favoured by the majority of colonists. Colonialists opposed the Tea Act on the grounds that it violated their no taxation without representation principle, as they had no representation in the British Parliament, which was responsible for imposing the tax. The colonists also thought that the Tea Act was an attempt to get them to agree that Parliament had power over their local government. They also thought it would lead to more taxes and rules in the future. These acts levied tariffs on goods that were brought into British territory from places that were not under British control. As a result, colonial commerce and economic growth were severely hindered. It is easy to wonder how a tax on sugar, which seems harmless at first glance, could lead to a revolution. These acts were only the spark that set off a chain reaction that brought to light a much more fundamental problem: taxation without representation. The colonists had long enjoyed a measure of self-government and had grown accustomed to making their own taxation decisions. This sense of autonomy was gradually but definitely destroyed by the Sugar Act and the four other acts that quickly followed, as they were pushed upon them without their input or approval from colonial legislatures. This flagrant disdain for their rights as English subjects bred resentment among the American people. More British troops were stationed in the colonies because of the Sugar Act. Wide-ranging authority was given to customs officers to inspect residences and ships for contraband, violating people's privacy and freedoms. These actions encountered opposition and contributed to the escalating animosity and defiance felt by the colonists. The American colonies were jolted into consciousness as a result of these deeds. It showed how oppressive British rule was and how important it was to have a sane taxes and government. The colonists resisted and opposed the restrictions and impositions vehemently, arguing that they lacked representation in Parliament and that taxation authority should rest solely with their own elected assemblies. They orchestrated demonstrations, petitions, protests, and boycotts as a means of voicing their discontent and urging the repeal of these acts. In order to plan their activities and connect with other colonies, they also organized organizations such as the Sons of Liberty. The Sugar Act increased hostility and conflict between the United States and Great Britain, altering their relationship. As British subjects, the colonists believed that the legislation infringed upon their rights, including the right to have only their own officials collect taxes. Additionally, they contended that the act was an attempt, without their permission, to regulate their commerce and economy. The Sons of Liberty movement began in Boston, Massachusetts in August 1765 and spread to other cities across the United States. The organization was founded by patriots who were opposed to the Stamp Act. Other colonies, including New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, were affected by the movement. They contended that the legislation was an attempt to regulate their trade and economy without their agreement, and that they shouldn't be taxed by a parliament in which they had no representation. In addition, they were angry over the most stringent enforcement of the legislation, which put their smuggling operations and their communities' codes in jeopardy. They coordinated a campaign to discourage the purchase of imported goods from Britain and promote the use of locally produced alternatives, particularly sugar and molasses. Petitioners and Englishmen alike submitted letters and petitions to Parliament and the monarch, pleading for the Act's repeal and asserting their rights. They established correspondence committees to disseminate propaganda and information while coordinating their resistance with neighbouring colonies. They engaged in public assemblies and protests, during which they torched effigies of British officials and tax collectors and subjected them to harassment and intimidation.
You're listening to the Sundeep Show.
The American Revolution, a fight for independence from Great Britain, was precipitated by the resistance movement of the Sons of Liberty and other colonists. In the British colonies, maritime matters were heard by the Vice Admiralty Courts. The Sugar Act of 1764, which levied tariffs on imported foreign sugar and other commodities into the colonies, was implemented with their assistance. The colonists took issue with the Vice Admiralty Court on the grounds that they did not use juries and that the judges sat in a biased and corrupt manner. In addition, they considered them as an infringement on their rights as British subjects, which included the right to a jury trial and representation in Parliament. One of the factors that led to colonial rebellion and the subsequent American Revolution was the existence of Vice Admiralty Courts. On the 5th of March 1770, a violent encounter took place between British soldiers and a mob of outraged colonists in Boston, which became known as the Boston Massacre. 5 people were killed and 6 others were injured when the military opened fire into the throng. The dispute over a wig maker's invoice initiated the incident, but it was further exacerbated by the accumulating animosity and strain that had persisted since the implementation of the Sugar Act and other British policies. The Boston Massacre came to represent the tyranny and oppression of British rule over the colonies and served as a focal point for colonial resistance. The establishment of a hostile and volatile environment between the British authorities and the colonists as a result of the Sugar Act of 1764 ultimately precipitated the Boston Massacre through the release of carnage and violence. On the 16th of December 1773, a political demonstration known as the Boston Tea Party was held in Boston Harbor. A group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The protest was organized as a reaction to the Tea Act of 1773, which authorized the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonists tax-free and granted it a monopoly on tea sales. The colonists perceived this as an additional instance of unrepresented taxes and a move to weaken the position of their local traders. The Sugar Act served as a wake-up call for the American colonies. It emphasized how harsh British control was and how important it is to have representation when it comes to government and taxation. This act, which may not have seemed very noteworthy on its own, was crucial in laying the foundation for the greater resistance movement that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Sundeep August. This is the Sundeep August Show. Remember, it wasn't only sugar, glass, paper, money, lumber, iron, or tea. It was about the basic freedoms and rights of the people who wanted to be free to make their own decisions. A watershed moment that catapulted the colonies along the road to revolution, and eventually independence. Thank you.
This is the Sundeep Show.